In this episode of Doing Economics, we will be continuing our study of the relationship between inflation and unemployment. In episode 1, we learned that in the 1960s, there was a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. For example, we learned that in 1961, the unemployment rate was 7%, which of course is not good, which is bad. But at the same time, the inflation rate, that's unemployment, the inflation rate was 1.6%, which is a good thing, as opposed to 1968, where we learned that the unemployment rate was 4% and inflation was 4.5%. Here, we are happy that the unemployment is at 4%, but we're not so happy that inflation is at 4.5%. So what we learned in the 60s by looking at this data, there's a trade-off that government can choose which one they prefer. Do you want a time period in which inflation is low, but the trade-off for that is a high unemployment, or do you want a time when most people are working and the trade-off for that is high inflation? Now, I called this slide "The Controversy Begins" because in the 1970s, people began to question the Phillips curve. And so I want to know, are there really two Phillips curves? So let's take a look at the data from 1970. Let me just switch my pen here. All right, so let's look at 1973. In 1973, you can see that the unemployment rate was 5.3%. You can see that the inflation rate of 1973 was almost 6%. Now, when we compare 1973 to 1968, what we see here is we no longer see actually the trade-off. One can see that the unemployment, went up, and we can see that the inflation went up. So in the 1970s, there was no longer any trade-off. As a matter of fact, what we call the situation in 1970 is stagflation. The stag represents an increase in unemployment. If an economy is stagnant, it means it's not moving. Where the inflation represents a society which has high inflation. So we call this stagflation. And once again, when we talked about this, we know that stagflation is caused by a leftward shift in the aggregate supply curve. So the question is, what in the 1970s caused supply to go down? And your answer is oil. The oil prices went up, which meant now businesses don't have as much money, which means they're not going to produce as much goods. So now we're moving from point A to point B. And when we move from point A to point B, we can see an increase in price, which is not a good thing. And we can see a decrease in GDP, which means a decrease in employment, which would be an increase in unemployment. And we can also see that that would be a bad. So rather than having one good and one bad, here we have two bads. Now, back to the question, are there really two Phillips curves? Well, here's the Phillips curve in the 1960. Here's the Phillips curve in the 1970. So what happened to that Phillips curve? Well, we can see by looking at the Phillips curve, and let's pretend we're right here at A. All right, so if we want to show stagflation, we know it's either got to be a movement or a shift. So let's just assume we know that in stagflation, the price level is going to go up. So let's assume we put B here, because you can see if A moves along the line to B, prices are going up. But what happens here along a movement along the line, you can see that then the unemployment rate would go down. And here we know the unemployment rate is not going down. So the only way to show stagflation is to have the Phillips curve shift to the right. Now, this is very important. I want you to picture the Phillips curve as, and I wish I could do better. I wish I could draw better. I wish I could speak better. I want you to think of this as a mirror. And so when you shift the AS, this then shifts the Phillips curve the opposite direction. And let me quickly explain why. Once again, down here, this is the amount of people that are employed. This here is the amount of people that are unemployed. So they're the exact opposite. Therefore, if you see a shift in left here, it then has to be a shift in right here because this is a mirror, because it's the exact opposite. So what we learned was that it is possible for the Phillips curve to actually shift due to an increase or decrease in AS. Here I showed you an example of a decrease in AS caused by the oil crisis. It could work the other way. If, for example, government would give business tax breaks, that now means that businesses are going to produce more because they have more money. When they produce more, we know that price level goes down and GDP goes up, which means in terms of the Phillips curve, you see inflation going down and you see unemployment going down. Once again, that's too good. So how do we show that? A shift to the right in the aggregate supply curve, because this is a mirror, is a shift to the left in the Phillips curve. So to recap, a shift in the AD causes a movement along the line. A shift in the AS causes a shift in the Phillips curve.